The steady beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils as consciousness slowly returned. My body felt like it was wrapped in concrete, heavy and unresponsive. Through the fog of medication, I heard voices familiar. Voices that should have brought comfort, but instead sent ice through my veins. "Look, I can't keep doing this." Jake's voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of medical equipment. "The doctors don't even know if she'll ever walk again. I have my career to think about, my future. I can't be tied down to someone who might be in a wheelchair forever." My heart shattered as I recognized my sister Sarah's voice, small and pleading. "But Jake, she loves you. She was driving to your company party when the accident happened. She was trying to surprise you." "That's exactly the problem," Jake snapped. "She's always been clingy, always trying to insert herself into my professional life. Maybe this is a sign that we weren't meant to be together. I need someone who can keep up with me, someone who can be an asset to my career, not a burden." Through barely opened eyes, I watched the man I had planned to marry pace beside my hospital bed like a caged animal. 3 years together, 3 years of supporting his ambitions, helping him through late nights and job interviews. And this was how he saw me, as a burden. The engagement ring on my finger suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "She's going to wake up soon," Sarah whispered, glancing toward my bed. "What are you going to tell her?" Jake's laugh was cold and hollow. "I'm not telling her anything. I'm leaving. By the time she's coherent enough to understand what's happening, I'll be gone. It's better this way, cleaner. She can focus on her recovery without the distraction of trying to maintain a relationship that was never going to work out anyway." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain from the accident. Here I was, lying broken in a hospital bed, and the man who had promised to love me in sickness and in health was abandoning me like I was damaged goods. But what hurt even more was hearing the relief in his voice, as if my accident had given him the perfect excuse to escape a commitment he never really wanted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed buzzed with an irritating persistence that matched the throbbing in my head. Every breath felt like fire in my chest, and when I tried to move my legs, nothing happened. Panic shot through me like electricity, but before I could process the full horror of my situation, I was forced to listen to the conversation that would change everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. Jake Morrison, the man who had slipped a promise ring on my finger just 6 months ago, stood at the foot of my bed discussing my future as if I were already dead. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his hairstyle just the way he liked it for important meetings. Even here, in a hospital room where his girlfriend lay fighting for her life, he couldn't stop being the image-conscious marketing executive who saw everything in terms of how it would affect his personal brand. "The thing is," Jay continued, his voice taking on that calculated tone I had heard him use with difficult clients, "Emma was always more invested in this relationship than I was. She's sweet, don't get me wrong, but she doesn't understand the kind of life I'm building. She works at that little accounting firm. She's content with mediocrity. I need someone who matches my ambition. Someone who can hold their own at corporate events and networking functions." My sister Sarah, barely 21 and still believing in fairy tale endings, looked at Jake with a mixture of confusion and disgust. She put herself through night school while working full-time to support both of you. She took care of your apartment, your meals, your entire life so you could focus on your career. How can you call that mediocrity? Supporting roles aren't what I need anymore, Jake replied dismissively. "I'm being considered for VP of Marketing. You know what kind of social expectations come with that position? I need a partner who can be an asset, not someone I have to take care of or make excuses for. Jessica understands that. She has her own following, her own brand. Together we make sense." Jessica, the name hit me like another collision. Jessica Ward, the social media influencer, with the perfect smile and the carefully curated Instagram feed. I had seen Jake looking at her posts, had caught him liking her photos a little too quickly, but I had trusted him when he said it was just professional networking. Now I understood that while I was working overtime to help pay for his expensive lifestyle, he was planning his exit strategy with someone who could offer him the glamorous life he thought he deserved. "You're going to leave her while she's in the hospital?" Sarah's voice cracked with disbelief. She almost died, Jake. The doctor said if she had arrived even 30 minutes later, the internal bleeding would have killed her, and you're worried. About your image? Jake straightened his tie. A gesture I had once found endearing, but now recognized as his way of armoring himself against uncomfortable emotions. I'm being practical. Relationships require two healthy, functional people. Emma's going to need months, maybe years of rehabilitation. Even if she recovers fully, which the doctors aren't guaranteeing, she's going to be different. Trauma changes. People, I can't build my future on maybes and what-ifs. The casual cruelty in his voice was breathtaking. This was the same man who had whispered promises about growing old together, who had talked about buying a house and starting a family. But apparently those promises came with conditions he had never bothered to mention, conditions that included me remaining perfectly healthy and convenient for his plans. What about her family? Sarah pressed. Her parents are driving up from Portland. What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them the truth, Jake said, already moving toward the door. Tell them that Emma deserves someone who can give her their full attention during her recovery. Tell them I realized I'm not that person. They'll understand. Eventually it's better for everyone if I'm honest about my limitations now, rather than stringing her along and making things worse later. Even in my medicated haze, I could hear the practiced nature of his words. He had rehearsed this speech, refined it until it sounded almost noble. He wasn't abandoning his critically injured girlfriend. He was making a mature decision about incompatibility. He wasn't being selfish. He was being honest about his limitations. The spin was so smooth, so polished, that if I hadn't known him as well as I did, I might have almost believed it myself. But I did know him. I knew that Jake Morrison had never met a situation he couldn't reframe to make himself look better. I knew that he had been pulling away from me for months, finding excuses to work late, declining invitations to spend time with my family, suggesting that maybe I should focus more on my own career instead of supporting his. The accident hadn't changed his feelings. It had simply given him the perfect excuse to act on feelings that had been shifting for a long time. She loves you, Sarah said quietly, and I could hear the tears in her voice. She was so excited. About that promotion you were up for? She had been planning to surprise you at the company party. She bought a new dress, spent 3 hours getting ready. She wanted to be the kind of girlfriend you could be proud of. The irony was suffocating. I had been racing through a winter storm, desperate to be by Jake's side for what he had described as the most important night of his career. I had wanted to show him that I could fit into his world, that I could be the sophisticated, polished partner he seemed to want. Instead, I had ended up here, broken and alone, while he used my injuries as justification for pursuing the relationship he had probably wanted all along. I know she does, Jake said, and for just a moment, his voice softened. And that's what makes this so hard. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes caring about someone means knowing when to step aside and let them find what they really need. It was a beautiful sentiment, wrapped in the kind of self-sacrificing nobility that made terrible actions seem almost heroic. But I could hear the relief underneath it, the eagerness to be done with this conversation and move on to the next chapter of his carefully planned life. He wasn't stepping aside for my benefit. He was stepping aside for his own and dressing it up as an act of love. I've already moved my things out of her apartment, Jake continued, destroying any lingering hope that this might be a temporary moment of panic. I left the key with the landlord and paid next month's rent. That should give her family time to figure out what they want to do with her stuff. I also canceled the joint credit card and moved my direct deposit back to my individual account. I thought it would be cleaner to handle the practical stuff while she's still unconscious. The efficiency of his exit strategy was stunning. While I had been fighting for my life in surgery, Jake had been systematically erasing 3 years of shared existence. He had reduced our entire relationship to a series of logistical problems to be solved, accounts to be separated, belongings to be redistributed. There was no grieving, no struggle with the decision, no wrestling with conflicting emotions. Just a clean corporate-style dissolution that prioritized minimal disruption to his own life. "You're really not going to say goodbye?" Sarah asked, and I could picture her looking between Jake and my unconscious form, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the stranger who was abandoning her sister. What would be the point? Jake replied. She's sedated, and when she wakes up, she's going to need all her energy for recovery. A dramatic goodbye scene isn't going to help anyone. It's better if I just disappear and let her focus on getting better. He was already at the door when he delivered his final words, the ones that would echo in my mind for months to come. Tell her I hope she makes a full recovery. Tell her she deserves someone who can love her the way she needs to be loved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, and tell her that someday she'll understand that this was the kindest thing I could do. The door closed with a soft click, and Jake Morrison walked out of my life as easily as he had once walked into it. No fanfare, no agonizing farewell. No acknowledgement of the years we had spent building what I had thought was a future together. Just the quiet sound of footsteps disappearing down the hospital corridor, taking with them every assumption I had ever made about love, loyalty, and what it meant to stand by someone when things got difficult. Sarah's quiet sobbing filled the silence Jake left behind, but even through my medication and pain, I felt something unexpected stirring alongside the heartbreak. It was anger, but not the desperate, self-destructive kind that might have consumed me in the past. This was something cleaner, sharper, more focused. Jake had shown me exactly who he was in my darkest hour, and while the revelation was devastating, it was also clarifying. For 3 years, I had been trying to become the woman I thought Jake wanted, more polished, more ambitious, more worthy of his attention and affection. I had worked extra hours to help fund his lifestyle, had taken on the emotional labor of maintaining our relationship, had slowly diminished my own dreams and goals to make room for his larger ones. And in return, the moment I became inconvenient, he had discarded me like an outdated piece of technology. But as I lay there in that hospital bed, listening to my sister cry for the future that had just been stolen from me, I realized something that would change everything. Jake Morrison had not saved me from a life of limitation. He had been the limitation. His abandonment wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would never again make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's vision of who I should be. The heart monitor beside my bed registered my increasing alertness, its beeping growing more rapid as consciousness fully returned. Soon, a nurse would notice that I was awake. Soon, I would have to face the reality of my injuries and begin the long journey of recovery. But first, I had a decision to make about what kind of person I was going to be when I emerged from this experience. I could be the victim of Jake's cruelty, the woman who let betrayal define her future, or I could be something else entirely, someone who used this devastating revelation as fuel for a transformation that would surprise everyone, including myself. As feeling began to return to parts of my body that had been numb with shock, I chose transformation. The weeks that followed Jake's departure blurred together in a haze of medical procedures, physical assessments, and well-meaning visitors who couldn't quite hide their pity. My parents had driven up from Portland the moment they received Sarah's call, and watching my father's face crumble when he saw me connected to various machines was almost worse than the physical pain. My mother, practical as always, had immediately taken charge of the logistics coordinating with my employer, managing insurance paperwork, and fielding the endless stream of questions from doctors who seemed to specialize in worst-case scenarios. The spinal injury was severe, but not complete, which the doctors explained with the kind of cautious optimism that medical/professionals use when they want to give hope without making promises. There was swelling, there was nerve damage, and there was a long road ahead filled with uncertainty. Some patients with similar injuries regained full mobility. Others did not. The human body, they told me repeatedly, was remarkably resilient, but also unpredictable. What mattered now was my attitude, my commitment to rehabilitation, and my willingness to work harder than I had ever worked for anything in my life. Dr. Michael Chen was the one who delivered most of these updates. From the beginning, there was something different about the way he spoke to me. Unlike the other medical staff who seemed to view me as a collection of symptoms and test results, Dr. Chen talked to me like I was still a whole person with thoughts, feelings, and agency over my own recovery. He was younger than I had expected. For someone with his level of responsibility, probably in his late 20s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of explaining complex medical information that never made me feel stupid or helpless. "The thing about spinal injuries," he said during one of our early conversations, pulling up a chair beside my bed instead of standing over me like most doctors did, "is that they force you to redefine what strength means. Physical strength is just one kind of power. Mental resilience, emotional intelligence, the ability to adapt and overcome, those are forms of strength that can carry you through anything." It was exactly what I needed to hear during those dark early days when every movement was agony and the future felt like a vast, unknowable void. Dr. Chen never minimized the challenges ahead, but he also never let me sink into the kind of despair that seemed to hover around the edges of everyone else's interactions with me. When other people looked at me, I could see them calculating limitations, adjusting their expectations downward, already mourning the person they thought I used to be. When Dr. Chen looked at me, he seemed to see possibilities. The absence of Jake became more noticeable as the initial crisis phase passed, and I moved into the slower, more grinding work of rehabilitation. Friends from work visited occasionally, bringing flowers and awkward conversation that petered out after they had exhausted their supply of cheerful platitudes. A college roommate came by once, spent 20 minutes updating me on mutual acquaintances, and then disappeared back into her busy life with obvious relief. Even my extended family seemed to struggle with how to interact with me, as if my accident had fundamentally changed not just my physical capabilities but my entire identity. But the person whose absence felt most profound was Jake himself. Not because I missed him, the anger and hurt had crystallized into something harder and more useful than longing, but because his complete disappearance from my life created a void that forced everyone else to confront the reality of what had happened. Friends who had known us as a couple struggled to know how to address his absence. Should they ask about him? Should they pretend he had never existed? Should they express outrage on my behalf or maintain diplomatic silence? Sarah, bless her, had no such confusion. She was furious with Jake in the pure, uncomplicated way that only a younger sister could be. And she wasn't shy about expressing her feelings to anyone who would listen. "He's a coward," she announced to our parents during one of their visits, her voice carrying the moral certainty of someone who had never faced a truly complex ethical dilemma. "Emma deserves so much better than someone who would abandon her when she needs him most." My mother, ever the diplomat, tried to moderate Sarah's anger with the kind of measured wisdom that comes from decades of marriage and the understanding that relationships are complicated. "People handle crisis differently," she said gently. Maybe Jake knew he wasn't strong enough to be what Emma needed during her recovery. Maybe he was trying to do the right thing by stepping aside. But my father, who had always prided himself on being a straightforward man who said what he meant and meant what he said, had no patience for such nuanced interpretations. "A real man doesn't run when things get tough," he said bluntly. "You make promises to someone, you keep them. Period. Emma's better off without him." The vindication of my father's anger was satisfying, but it also highlighted something that had been bothering me since the moment. I overheard Jake's conversation with Sarah. Everyone was talking about what Jake should have done. What kind? A person his actions revealed him to be, what his departure meant for my future. But no one seemed particularly interested in what I thought about any of it, or how I was processing the dual trauma of physical injury and emotional betrayal. It was Dr. Chen who finally asked the question that everyone else seemed afraid to. Voice. "How are you handling the relationship stuff?" said one afternoon as he reviewed my latest test results. Obviously your primary focus needs to be on recovery. But emotional stress can significantly impact physical healing. If you want to talk about it, I'm here. If you'd prefer to speak with someone else, I can arrange that too." The directness of his question caught me off guard, partly because no one else had been brave enough to address the elephant in the room so directly, and partly because I wasn't sure I knew how to articulate what I was feeling. The traditional narrative of abandonment and heartbreak didn't quite fit my experience. Yes, I was hurt and angry, but there was something else underneath those emotions, something that felt almost like relief. "I think," I said slowly, testing the words as I spoke them, "I'm starting to realize that Jake did me a favor. Not intentionally, and not in a way that excuses how he handled it. But his leaving forced me to see our relationship clearly for the first time in years. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly but didn't interrupt, giving me space to work through thoughts I was still forming. I spent so much energy trying to be the person I thought he wanted, I continued. I made myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I prioritized his career over mine, his comfort over my own needs. I convinced myself that was what love looked like: sacrifice and compromise and putting the other person first. But what I was really doing was auditioning for a role in his life, and apparently I didn't get the part. The admission felt dangerous, like I was confessing to some fundamental failure of character. But Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral and attentive, free of the judgment I had been fearing. Relationships shouldn't be auditions, he said. Simply, the right person will appreciate who you are, not who you're trying to become for their benefit. It was such a basic concept, so obvious that I should have understood it years ago, but hearing it stated so clearly felt revolutionary. For the first time since the accident, I felt something other than pain or anger about Jake's departure. I felt curious about who I might become without the constant pressure of trying to earn his approval. The physical therapy sessions became a laboratory for exploring this new sense of self-determination. The rehabilitation process was grueling, involving hours of exercises that pushed my body to its limits and beyond. Some days I made measurable progress, regaining sensation in areas that had been numb, achieving movements that had seemed impossible the week before. Other days I felt like I was sliding backward, losing ground I had fought to gain, confronting the possibility that some limitations might be permanent. But through it all, I discovered reserves of determination I hadn't known I possessed. A version of myself that had spent 3 years catering to Jake's needs and preferences had been cautious, accommodating, conflict-averse. The woman who was fighting to regain control of her body was fierce, stubborn, and absolutely unwilling to accept other people's limitations on what she could achieve. "You're different," Sarah observed during one of her visits, watching me navigate. The parallel bars, with a combination of grim determination and genuine excitement about each small victory. "I mean, obviously the situation is terrible, but you seem more like yourself than you have in years." She was right, though I wouldn't have been able to articulate it that way. The person I was becoming through the rehabilitation process felt both completely new and strangely familiar. Like I was rediscovering aspects of my personality that had been dormant for so long, I'd forgotten they existed. The woman who had dated Jake Morrison had been accommodating and self-effacing. The woman who was learning to walk again was discovering that she had opinions, preferences, and boundaries that she wasn't willing to negotiate away. Dr. Chen seemed to notice the change too, though he was too professional to comment on it directly. Instead, he began adjusting his approach to my care, treating me less like a patient who needed to be managed and more like a partner in the rehabilitation process. He started asking for my input on treatment decisions, respecting my assessment of what was working and what wasn't, and encouraging me to set my own goals for recovery rather than simply accepting the targets established by the medical team. "Most people in your situation focus on getting back to where they were before the accident," he said during one of our sessions. "But sometimes trauma gives us an opportunity to become someone even better than we were before. The question isn't just whether you'll walk against who you want to be when you do." The insight was both liberating and terrifying. For years, my identity had been so intertwined with my relationship with Jake that I had lost track of my individual desires and ambitions. Now, faced with the prospect of rebuilding my life from the ground up, I had to confront the reality that I wasn't entirely sure who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's ideal girlfriend. The process of self-discovery accelerated when I was finally discharged from the hospital and moved to the rehabilitation center for the next phase of my recovery. Mountain View Rehabilitation Center was a sprawling complex designed to help people with various injuries and disabilities regain their independence. And being there forced me to confront both the severity of my situation and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. My fellow patients included a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding, a teenager who had been injured in a diving accident, a grandmother recovering from a stroke, and a veteran dealing with injuries sustained overseas. Each of them had their own story of trauma and recovery, their own struggles with accepting help while fighting to regain autonomy, their own complex relationships with the gap between who they had been before and who they were becoming now. What struck me most about this community was how little patience anyone had for self-pity or dwelling on past circumstances. The focus was relentlessly forward-looking, practical, and oriented toward problem-solving rather than blame or regret. When I mentioned Jake's departure during a group therapy session, the response wasn't the sympathetic outrage I had received from family and friends, but a kind of matter, a fact acceptance, that some people simply aren't equipped to handle crisis. "Count yourself lucky you found out now," said Margaret, the grandmother who was relearning to speak clearly after her stroke. "Better to know someone's true character during the crisis than to waste more years on someone who was never really committed to begin with." It was the kind of unsentimental wisdom that comes from lived experience, and it helped me reframe Jake's abandonment as useful information rather than personal failure. He had shown me exactly who he was when faced with difficulty, and that knowledge, however painful, was ultimately valuable. The Rehabilitation Center also introduced me to the concept of adaptive living, the idea that limitations could be accommodated rather than simply endured. I met people who had rebuilt careers, relationships, and entire life trajectories around new physical realities. They had learned to drive with hand controls, modified their homes for accessibility, found new ways to participate in activities they loved, and in many cases, discovered capabilities and interests they had never known they possessed. Dr. Chen visited regularly to monitor my progress, and his presence became one of the highlights of my week. Unlike the other medical professionals who treated me with clinical professionalism, Dr. Chen seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences beyond my medical condition. He asked about my background, my career, my plans for the future, and he listened to my answers with the kind of focused attention that had become rare in my life. "What did you want to be when you were a kid?" he asked during one of his visits, settling into the chair beside my bed, with the relaxed posture that indicated he had time for a real conversation. "A teacher," I answered without hesitation. I wanted to work with elementary school kids, help them discover that learning could be fun and exciting. I had this whole fantasy about decorating my classroom and coming up with creative lesson plans and being the teacher that kids would remember fondly when they were adults. What happened to that dream? The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Life, I guess. College was expensive, and the education program was competitive. When I met Jake, he was so focused on his career goals, so ambitious and driven. I started thinking that maybe I should find something more practical, something that would provide steady income while he got established. Accounting seemed safe, reliable. I told myself I could always go back to teaching later when we were more settled. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" "Now I'm realizing that later was never going to come," I said. "There was always going to be another goal, another milestone, another reason to postpone my own plans. I was waiting for permission to pursue my own dreams, and the person I was waiting for was never going to give it." The conversation stayed with me long after Dr. Chen left, partly because it forced me to confront how thoroughly I had abandoned my own aspirations, but also because it highlighted the difference between my relationship with Jake and my interactions with Dr. Chen. Jake had always been subtly dismissive of my teaching ambitions, suggesting that I was being unrealistic about the financial challenges, the difficult working conditions, the limited opportunities for advancement. Dr. Chen, by contrast, seemed to find my childhood dreams both natural and achievable. "You know," he said during his next visit, "there's a program here where patients who are further along in their recovery work with newcomers who are just beginning the process. It's not formal teaching exactly, but it involves a lot of the same skills patients. Empathy, the ability to break down complex tasks into manageable steps. You might find it fulfilling." The suggestion sparked something in me that had been dormant for years. The idea of helping other people navigate the challenges I was facing, of using my experience to make someone else's journey a little easier, felt both meaningful and achievable. It was the kind of work that would matter regardless of my physical limitations, the kind of contribution that would draw on my strengths rather than highlighting my deficits. I volunteered for the peer support program the following week. And from the moment I sat down with my first mentee, a young man who had been injured in a motorcycle accident and was struggling with depression and anger about his changed circumstances, I knew I had found something important. The conversation skills I had developed during my years with Jake, the patience I had cultivated while managing his moods and expectations, the empathy I had learned through my own struggle with identity and self-worth, all of these experiences suddenly felt useful rather than wasteful. Working with other patients also gave me perspective on my own recovery that I hadn't been able to achieve in isolation. Seeing their progress, their setbacks, their moments of breakthrough and despair helped me understand that healing wasn't a linear process with clear milestones and predictable outcomes. It was messier, more individual, more dependent on psychological resilience than physical capability. Some people with minor injuries struggled for months with basic tasks, while others with severe limitations found ways to exceed every medical prediction. The realization that my recovery was as much about mental attitude as physical capacity was both empowering and daunting. It meant that I had more control over my outcome than I had initially understood, but it also meant that I couldn't blame external circumstances if I failed to achieve my goals. The responsibility for my future rested squarely on my own shoulders, which was both terrifying and liberating after years of deferring major decisions to Jake's preferences and priorities. As winter turned to spring and my physical capabilities continued to improve, I began to envision a future that looked completely different from the life I had been planning before the accident. Instead of the safe, conventional path I had been following as Jake's supportive girlfriend, I saw possibilities for adventure, independence, and meaningful work that served others. The accident had stripped away the illusion that I could control external circumstances, but it had also revealed that I had far more agency over my own choices than I had been exercising. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. There were days when the physical pain was overwhelming, when the uncertainty about my long-term prognosis felt unbearable, when the loneliness of rebuilding my life without the familiar anchor of my relationship with Jake seemed too daunting to face. But there were also days when I felt stronger, more capable, and more authentically myself than I had in years. Dr. Chen seemed to notice the change in my demeanor and energy. "You're like a completely different person than you were when you first arrived," he observed during one of our sessions. More confident, more self-possessed. His comment pleased me more than I wanted to admit, partly because his opinion had become important to me in ways I was still trying to understand, but also because it confirmed what I had been sensing about my own transformation. The woman who had been rushed to Riverside General Hospital after her car accident had been broken in more ways than one: physically injured, emotionally devastated, psychologically diminished by years of making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's vision of her life. The woman who was preparing to leave the rehabilitation center was whole in ways that had nothing to do with her physical limitations and everything to do with their newfound understanding of her own worth and capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jake's abandonment, which had initially felt like the worst thing that could happen during an already traumatic experience, had actually been the catalyst for the most important period of growth in my adult life. His departure had forced me to confront my own patterns of self-sacrifice and people-pleasing, to recognize the ways I had been diminishing myself in pursuit of approval, and to discover strengths and interests I had been neglecting for years. As I prepared for the next phase of my recovery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about my future. Not the anxious anticipation of trying to meet someone else's expectations, but the deep satisfaction of pursuing goals that felt authentically mine. The accident had taken away the life I thought I wanted, but it had given me something far more valuable: the opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped trying to be someone else. 6 months after leaving the rehabilitation center, I stood in the doorway of the coffee corner, watching the morning rush of Riverside General Hospital staff grab their caffeine fixes before starting their shifts. The small cafe had become my second home, though not in the way I had originally planned. What had started as a part-time job to help with my transition back to independent living had evolved into something much more significant: a business partnership that was reshaping not just my financial future, but my entire understanding of what I was capable of achieving. The owner, Mrs. Patricia Santos, had been skeptical when I first approached her about working at the cafe. It's not because of my physical limitations, which had become minimal after months of dedicated rehabilitation, but because she couldn't understand why someone with my background would want to work in food service. "You're an accountant," she had said, looking at my resume with confusion. "This is entry-level work. Are you sure you wouldn't rather look for something in your field?" But that was exactly the point. I didn't want to go back to my field, at least not in the traditional sense. The months of recovery had given me clarity about what actually mattered to me. And sitting in a sterile office, managing other people's financial records, wasn't it? I wanted to be around people, to be part of a community, to use my skills in ways that felt meaningful rather than merely profitable. "I've been thinking about this wrong," I had told Mrs. Santos during our second conversation, after she had seen me naturally fall into conversations with the medical staff who frequented the cafe. "You're not just selling coffee. You're providing an essential service to people who work incredibly demanding jobs. This place is where they decompress, connect with colleagues, fuel up for difficult shifts. There's real value in that, and I think there's potential to do it even better." Mrs. Santos had been running the coffee corner for 15 years, ever since her husband's death had left her looking for a way to support herself and stay busy. She understood the importance of the service she provided, but she had never thought of it in strategic terms. When I started talking about customer retention, profit margins, and expansion opportunities, her eyes lit up with interest. "What are you proposing?" she had asked. "Partnership," I had said, surprising myself with the boldness of the suggestion. "Invest in upgrading the equipment, expanding the menu, improving the marketing, provide the experience, the customer. Relationships, the operational knowledge." We split the profits based on our respective contributions. The conversation had led to a handshake agreement that had transformed both of our lives. Using the insurance settlement from my accident money that Jake had assumed would be tied up in medical bills for years, I had invested in commercial-grade espresso machines, an expanded selection of healthy grab-and-go options, and a complete renovation of the cafe's interior. Mrs. Santos had contributed her deep knowledge of the hospital's rhythms, her relationships with longtime customers, and her intuitive understanding of what healthcare workers needed during their brief breaks from saving lives. The results had exceeded both of our expectations. Revenue had increased by 60% in the first quarter after the renovation, and we were now serving 3 times as many customers as we had when I first started working there. More importantly, Coffee Corner had become a genuine community hub where exhausted residents could decompress, where nurses could catch up with colleagues from other departments, where attending physicians could have informal consultations over expertly prepared lattes. But the most satisfying aspect of the business wasn't the financial success, it was the relationships I had built with the regular customers. Dr. Chen had been one of the first to notice the changes we were making, and his enthusiastic support had helped spread the word throughout the hospital. Other staff members had begun stopping by, not just for coffee, but for conversation, advice, and the kind of emotional support that came naturally in an environment where people felt genuinely cared for. "You've created something special here," Dr. Chen had told me a few weeks earlier, lingering at the counter after the morning rush had cleared. "It's not just about the coffee, though. That's significantly better than it used to be. It's about the atmosphere, the way you make people feel welcome and valued. That's not something you can teach or fake." His words had meant more to me than I had been prepared to admit. Over the months of my recovery, Dr. Chen had become more than just my physician. He had become a friend, confidant, and increasingly, someone whose opinion mattered to me in ways that had nothing to do with medical care. Our conversations had evolved from updates about my physical progress to discussions about our backgrounds, our goals, our perspectives on everything from healthcare policy to the best hiking trails in the area. I had learned that Dr. Chen's parents had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 5 years old, that he had worked his way through medical school with a combination of scholarships and brutal work schedules, and that he had chosen emergency medicine because he wanted to be on the front lines of helping people during the worst moments of their lives. His dedication to his patients was legendary throughout the hospital. But what struck me most was his ability to see potential in people when they couldn't see it in themselves. You know, he had said during one of our conversations, "I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to help people navigate difficult transitions. Have you ever considered going back to school for counseling or social work? With your background in business and your personal experience with trauma recovery, you could make a real difference in people's lives." The suggestion had planted a seed that had been growing in my mind for weeks. The work I had done as a peer mentor at the rehabilitation center had been some of the most fulfilling of my life. And I had continued volunteering there even after my formal treatment had ended. The idea of turning that passion into a career felt both exciting and terrifying exciting, because it aligned with my deepest values and interests. Terrifying because it would mean committing to a path that looked nothing like the safe, conventional life I had been planning with Jake. But Jake's vision of my future had been based on limitation and compromise. The woman I was becoming had no interest in playing it safe or settling for less than what she truly wanted. The accident had taught me that security was largely an illusion anyway, that life could change in an instant. That the only real security came from knowing you could adapt and thrive regardless of circumstances. I've been looking into graduate programs. I had told Dr. Chen during his most recent visit to the cafe. There's a counseling psychology program at the State University that has a specialization in trauma recovery. It's designed for working professionals, so I could keep running the cafe while I'm in school. His face had lit up with genuine excitement. "Emma, that's incredible. You'd be amazing at that. I have such a natural ability to connect with people, to help them see their own strength. And your business background would be invaluable. So many therapists struggle with the practical aspects of building a practice." The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, long past the point when Dr. Chen should have been heading home after his shift. We had talked about the application process, the financial considerations, the challenges of balancing school with business ownership. But underneath the practical discussion, there had been something else, a current of mutual respect and genuine affection that had been building for months. "I should probably let you get back to work," Dr. Chen had finally said, glancing around the cafe at the afternoon customers who were beginning to filter in. "But I want you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. When I first met you, you were broken in so many ways. Now look at you, you're building businesses, planning for graduate school, helping other people heal. It's remarkable." The word proud had hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Jake had never expressed pride in my accomplishments, partly because he had never really seen them as accomplishments. My work had been valuable only insofar as it supported his goals, my achievements meaningful only if they enhanced his own success. The idea that someone could be proud of me for pursuing my own dreams, for becoming more fully myself, felt revolutionary. "Thank you," I had said, and the words had carried more weight than a simple acknowledgement of his compliment. "For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for seeing possibilities when I could only see limitations. You've been exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it." The moment had stretched between us, filled with words that neither of us was quite ready to say. Dr. Chen had reached out as if to touch my hand, then caught himself, professional boundaries reasserting themselves even as personal feelings threatened to overwhelm them. "I should go," he had said softly. "But Emma, when you're ready, when you feel like the time is right, I'd like to take you to dinner, not as your doctor, not as a friend checking on your progress, but as someone who cares about you and wants to get to know you better outside of all this." The invitation had been both thrilling and terrifying. After Jake's abandonment, I had assumed that romance was something I would approach cautiously, if at all. The idea of opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability again had seemed impossible. But Dr. Chen wasn't Jake, and the woman I had become wasn't the same person who had been devastated by betrayal 18 months earlier. "I'd like that," I had said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I'd like that very much." Now standing in the cafe and watching the familiar rhythm of the morning rush, I felt a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with romantic relationships and everything to do with finally understanding who I was and what I wanted from life. The accident had stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself, but it had also given me the opportunity to rebuild from the ground up, to create a life based on my own values and desires rather than someone else's expectations. The insurance settlement that Jake had assumed would be consumed by medical bills had instead become the foundation for a new career. The physical limitations that he had seen as permanent disabilities had been overcome through determination and hard work. The emotional devastation that he had predicted would define my future had been transformed into wisdom, compassion, and a deeper understanding of what really mattered in life. Mrs. Santos emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of fresh pastries, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had found new purpose in work she had been doing for years. "The cranberry scones are flying off the shelves," she announced. "I think we need to double the recipe for tomorrow." "Done," I said, making a note in the order book. And I got confirmation that the nursing school wants to set up a regular catering arrangement for their monthly meetings. That's going to be a nice, steady revenue stream. "You know," Mrs. Santos said, setting down the tray and looking at me with the kind of maternal affection that had developed between us over the months, "when you first walked in here, I thought you were just someone who needed a job to get back on your feet. I had no idea you were going to revolutionize my entire business." "We revolutionized it together," I corrected. "I had ideas, but you had the relationships and the experience to make them work. That's what partnership is supposed to look like." The word partnership had taken on new meaning for me over the past year. My relationship with Jake had been characterized by imbalance, by one person's needs and goals taking precedence over the others. What I had with Mrs. Santos, and what I was beginning to explore with Dr. Chen, was something completely different. Mutual respect and support that enhanced both people rather than diminishing one for the benefit of the other. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see Dr. Chen walking in, still wearing his scrubs from the overnight shift. He looked exhausted but pleased, the way he always did after a particularly challenging but successful night in the emergency department. "The usual?" I asked, already reaching for the largest cup and starting to prepare his preferred combination of espresso and steamed milk. "Please," he said, settling into his customary spot at the counter. "It's been a long night, but a good one. We had a car accident victim come in around midnight, spinal injury. Similar to yours, actually. The family was panicking, convinced that his life was over. I was able to tell them about someone I know who had a similar injury and went on to build an amazing life for herself." The implication of his words hit me like a physical force. I had become not just a success story, but an example that could give hope to other people facing similar challenges. The transformation that had felt so personal, so private, had implications. Beyond my own healing, "How is he doing?" I asked, handing him his coffee. It's too early to tell definitively, but the initial signs are encouraging. More importantly, his family is approaching the situation with hope instead of despair. They're focusing on possibilities rather than limitations. That makes all the difference in recovery outcomes. The conversation continued as other customers filtered in and out, but I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of personal transformation. Jake had abandoned me because he saw my accident as a limitation, as something that would diminish both our lives. But what he had failed to understand is that sometimes the most difficult experiences become the foundation for the most meaningful growth. The woman who had been rushed to Riverside General Hospital after her car accident had been living a life of quiet compromise, shrinking herself to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. The woman who was now planning to pursue graduate school while running a successful business had discovered that her true strength lay not in accommodation, but in authenticity. As the morning rush wound down and the cafe settled into its quieter afternoon rhythm, I found myself thinking about the future with a sense of excitement I hadn't felt in years. The graduate school application was nearly complete. The business was thriving, and there was a kind, brilliant man who saw me not as a collection of limitations to be managed, but as a whole person with unlimited potential. Taken away the life I thought I wanted, but it had given me something far more valuable, the opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped trying to be someone else. Jake's abandonment, which had initially felt like the worst thing that could happen during an already traumatic experience, had actually been the catalyst for the most important period of growth in my adult life. Standing in the cafe that had become the symbol of my transformation, surrounded by the community I had helped build, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Not gratitude for the accident itself, but for the strength I had discovered in response to it, for the relationships I had built through vulnerability and authenticity, for the future I was creating based on my own values and desires rather than someone else's expectations. The woman Jake had left behind in that hospital bed had been broken in more ways than one. The woman I had become was whole in ways that had nothing to do with physical limitations and everything to do with finally understanding my own worth. The accident had ended one chapter of my life, but it had also begun a new one where I was the author of my own story, the architect of my own happiness, and the creator of my own definition of success. As I looked toward the future, I saw not limitations but possibilities, not reasons for fear but reasons for excitement. The best part of my story wasn't behind MIT was still being written, one authentic choice at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right? On your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.